This is segment 1 of the second module, and this brief segment will provide a very crude, very overly simplistic review of social class. And if you're a sociologist, anthropologist, or anybody who's ever studied any kind of critical social theory, just grin and bear it or skip this segment altogether because this is really the baby 101 version. However, I'll draw heavily on the 2009 piece by Eric Olin-Wright, and if you haven't read this piece, regardless of however much background you've had on social theory and social class and social stratification, I highly recommend it because his work is very accessible, very thoughtful, and provides a nice integration of different conceptual approaches to social class, which is what I'll touch on very, very briefly with this segment. So, of course, we can't talk about social class without talking about Karl Marx and his conception of social class. And as even those of us who haven't studied social theory and social class in depth recognize that Marx's positions and approaches to class are fundamentally about a structural position in society in relation to society's mode of production. And his conceptualization consists primarily of two discrete social groups or cleavages: the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class, of course, who are those who own and control the means of production, and the larger class, the proletariat or the working class, who exist in the system to sell their labor, don't have control over the means of production, and are therefore the subjugated class in this relatively binary system or conceptualization of social class. His model intrinsically recognizes, therefore, a power asymmetry between the social classes, and also is a construction of class that is inherently relational in nature. And what that means, and this is an important concept for many of the axes of social stratification we cover, it's relational in the sense that the class positions are defined in relation to each other and there is interdependence within them. And more specifically, what that means is that there's a causal relationship between them. And in that one social class exists and the nature of that class exists in relation to or as a function of the other social class or social classes. We'll elaborate on that more further soon. The nature of that relational dynamic between social classes is inherently, according to Marx, exploitative, in that these relations of production inherently involve the exploitation of the labor, the productivity of one social class, the working class, by the capitalists in terms of exploiting the labor and profiting from the excess, the surplus of that labor in order to reap profits. And this is a normative perspective on class as well. It's not simply diagnostic or descriptive because, as Marx sees it, this exploitative nature of the relationships between social classes are inherently entailing more moral degradation as a result of this relationship. And his class and conception of class also incorporates really important elements of class identity, the ways in which ideology naturalizes these class relations, and also and therefore supports them and enables their reproduction over time. And also elements of class consciousness and closely related to identity, awareness of class position vis-a-vis others, and also awareness of the workings of the class system overall are important elements of Marx's model. And of course, this is a project, this descriptive project and normative project is part of a larger project, which is related to the prescription for class struggle as the means by which the class system gets altered and fundamentally, radically re-altered as a way of, as the only way in which inequality is remedied. Max Weber's conception of social class intersects with Marx's and diverges somewhat. He recognizes, of course, the prominence and the role of social classes defined in economic terms. in society in a class organization. But he also goes beyond the primarily binary model of Marx and recognizes greater differentiation with multiple different kinds of social class cleavages along economic lines. In addition to economic social classes, though, he puts into the model additional other competing and intersecting bases of group formation and stratification, what he refers to as status groups, which are defined in terms of social and cultural resources and status differentials, as well as political differences between groups, which allow for another form of power and differentiation and stratification. The ability for individuals to occupy multiple social positions along these different intersecting axes also allows for the existence of status inconsistencies, that somebody can occupy a high social class position defined in terms of social or cultural resources, but occupy a relatively low social class in economic terms. So somebody can have a very low occupational position, for example, and be, let's say, working class, a janitor, etc., but be the deacon of the church. And that is a sort of typical example of how occupation in location in different social classes and positions by Weber allow for contradictory or inconsistent positions that may exist, and that these things often travel together but can diverge. The model articulates the concept of how one's life chances dictated by the social locations then ultimately can be related to the possibility of social mobility. And social mobility in this conception allows for incremental change in individual social location, as opposed to Marx, which really didn't allow for social mobility. And the only way that people's location in the social structure gets changed is through radical, fundamental restructuring of the class order overall. Weber's conception also allows for some of the subjective dimensions of stratification in terms of how people perceive their positions and how that subjective perception of and understanding of one's social location may also be relevant for their social experience. And not unlike Marx, recognizes the centrality, power relations, and control over resources as being really sort of paramount in the ways in which class structures operate. Again, diverging from Marx a little bit is the recognition of a plurality of hierarchical systems, that it's not simply one axis in relation to the society's quote-unquote mode of production, but that there are multiple dimensions in which systems of domination and subordination are operative. And this pluralism or greater fragmentation is a really important hallmark feature of Weber's class conceptualization in contrast to Marx. What Eric Olin Wright does is give us a way past the traditional epic battles that have existed between these different conceptions of social class. And what he argues for is what he refers to as a pragmatic realism, which is an attempt to integrate these competing traditions of inquiry and explanation to understand social class. And he argues that the different models all have their merits and different utilities depending on the particular agenda at hand in terms of what's trying to be explained, understood, predicted. And that they each contribute different understandings of social life and proposed causal mechanisms to explain the existence of and the persistence of social inequalities. So again, I really encourage a read of Eric Olin Wright's piece because it both provides a much better background on the different traditions than what I've articulated here in a very accessible way, but also highlights their intersections and overlaps and complementarity, and then provides this nice integration and a way of integrating the different traditions to think about how they each uniquely contribute and complement each other in order to try to understand contemporary social class. And what Wright winds up with is three complementary but distinct models. The first is sort of traditional social stratification approaches, looking at background and attribution characteristics of individuals to see how these characteristics, which are things that are economically relevant traits or circumstances, things that are available from birth or acquired early on, that ultimately dictate market chances and economic well-being of individuals. Things like education, connections, access to resources, access to knowledge and connections, and so forth. Thing is just basic smarts and general drive and so forth. Characteristics of individuals that we look at to try to understand how they are that we look at because they help us understand subsequent market chances, life chances, and economic well-being. In contrast to that, he draws on this construct from Weber. Losing my voice, this is not going to work. Excuse me. Of opportunity hoarding, which refers to the unequal protective practices of groups in order to ensure the resources and benefits of their in-group status. And opportunity hoarding is a concept that is a mechanism of social closure that creates institutional barriers of various kinds that ultimately restrict access of others to things of that group that are prized, valued, things like credentials, rights, etc. So what opportunity hoarding does for us is it starts unpacking the background kind of conditions in the previous model that are often taken for granted. It explores how unequal starting points, but also ongoing mechanisms of social closure are things like institutionalized protection through credentialing, licensure, law, property rights, and earning access to scarce lots. These things are ultimately rigged in ways that prevent those who are outside of these social groups in possession of these rights and goods are able to protect them and keep them scarce, prevent other people from obtaining them as well. And the third model of rights draws on Marx to really articulate processes of exploitation and domination, showing how not only control over scarce resources and exclusionary rules are part of the system, but profit is generated from the labor and subordinate position of other people. And so the upper class's advantage class position is a function not only of the fact of having the optimal background and attributes, being able to leverage opportunity hoarding mechanisms that allow retention of control over scarce resources and allow mechanisms to exclude other people. But in addition, there is the mechanism of class location related to profiting from directly the subjugation of other people in other social classes and exploiting the profit from that dominant social position as well. And here I've put together a little bit more of a visual representation of these three models. So if we start with the stratification or attribution model, and we have this simplistic division of society into three social classes. The upper class would be primarily capitalists, according to Wright. These are people with control and ownership over the means of production, control and ownership of capital. The middle class here, people who have access to privileges and opportunities and resources by virtue, in many cases, of attainment of attributions and also the ability to exclude others from the resources they possess. And then the lower class would be more working class, those who are relatively marginalized from resources in society and opportunities to attain them. And of course, there's differentiation within each of these three classes, but for our purposes, we'll just keep this schematic really simple. So the stratification attribution model is concerned with who is sorted where. How do people wind up in these different social positions? And what are the drivers of social location in these three social classes? And what then are the implications of social location in each of these social classes for subsequent life chances, material conditions, and in our case, we would also be concerned with things like health. So the focus here is on what's in this red box, and the inherited or acquired characteristics of individuals that are a function of their background, upbringing, and early life opportunity structures. And so we're primarily, again, concerned with what are the factors that dictate here how people are socially located within each of the existing class positions of the class structure. The other two models are both relational. And again, what this means is that there's a causal connection between the privileges and advantages of the upper and middle class relative to the classes below them in ways that are directly interdependent. The privileges of the upper classes are a function of the disadvantage of the lower classes and vice versa. So there is a relational, causal, interdependent relationship dynamic between these social classes themselves. They exist in relation to each other and they function in relation to each other. And so here, relational models will be much more attentive to why there is sorting in the first place and how it works, and it will reveal the workings of the class structure, specifically the interdependence and dynamic interplay of class positions, not just how individuals are located within them. So the first would be a relational model would be the opportunity hoarding, courtesy of Weber's model. And here the action of attention, the focus of attention is much more here in the middle, relatively speaking, and specifically how the middle classes protect their positions and interests against potential encroachers from below. So the examples would be things like educational attainment and requirements for professional occupations, licensure requirements in various industries, and so forth. Now, this is very intuitive to most of us who have attained some educational achievement, in the sense that we recognize that if there is that the value of our educational credentials are directly related to, tied to their scarcity. And if there was suddenly a flooding of people with master's degrees, PhDs, MDs, and so forth, that the value, the currency of our educational achievements in terms of our social class and how that educational attainment translates into economic opportunities would suddenly be very dramatically diluted. And so we see opportunity hoarding playing out with formal laws and institutional barriers restricting immigration, restricting access to control over capital, like through property rights laws and so forth. And then we also see it through various examples in licensure requirements, credentialing. And what I like about this model of opportunity hoarding is that it highlights a couple of not necessarily intuitive ways in which social closure works. One is that we assume that social closure is the kind of mechanism exercised by the most privileged, by masters of the universe who keep everybody away from their sources of privilege. But in fact, it operates at all levels of the social hierarchy, and that's exemplified in an article in the New York Times with the title "So You Think You Can Be a Hair Braider" that I have posted, which really shows how things like even unions, which we typically think of as champions of the working class, are themselves examples of institutions executing social closure through opportunity hoarding, because the idea there is that is an attempt by unions to restrict capitalists from access to labor that is not part of the union, which ultimately in many ways is very good for disrupting and challenging social inequalities, but also is really has the effect of maximizing the benefit for the in-group, meaning in this case unionized workers. The other thing I like about it is that it also provides an insight into what many of us assume from a consumer perspective are mechanisms there to protect us. We get the idea, or like to think, that the reason why there are laws that require people in various trades to have licenses and credentials, that they're there to protect the consumer, to make sure that this practitioner is skilled, is safe, is following regulations, and so forth. And in fact, while that may be true, what it also is a mechanism of social closure by the practitioners of that particular trade. And again, this article in the New York Times really illustrates this nicely, because what you see is that the individuals who are really at the forefront of often lobbying for laws that require people to have licenses to practice and so forth are the people who are themselves engaged in the trade, because they want to increase barriers to entry of others into that occupation or trade. And then if we look at the relational model of exploitation and domination, courtesy of Marx, there disproportionately the action is relatively at the upper ends, where the upper classes not only control access to opportunity, but also dominate and exploit those below in order to, again, that's the causal connection, create and maintain their resource and power advantages. So if you think of a contemporary example, CEOs and shareholders are able to extract and monopolize profits for personal wealth because they leverage influence to weaken unionization, thereby dismantling opportunity hoarding structures of the middle class, and, for example, outsource to fragile and weak lower class labor pools where wages are low and job benefits and protections are minimal. So again, the privileges enjoyed by the upper class are a function of their ability to maintain their privileged position by keeping other people out of it, but also by exploiting what their relative position vis-a-vis others and profiting as a result. And if you think about this from a corporate perspective, of course, how do corporations maximize their profits? They reduce their costs, often through reducing their labor costs as the way to maximize profit without having to increase prices that are passed on to the consumers, which then may, of course, decrease sales. So if we just think of the people who own and operate and profit from corporations as extensions of them, then we can see how those individuals occupying those positions are enjoying their relative social position as a function of these processes, these mechanisms that exploit and dominate those below them. That's the end. Again, I apologize for the brevity and simplicity of this treatment of social class, but I want to put it out there because what it does is give us a setup and some background to understand how we in social epidemiology treat social class, the models we use, the theory that we're drawing on to then incorporate measures of social class and social position into the study of population health outcomes. And this can hopefully give us some background to understand where we're coming from, but also to understand some of the important limitations of the approaches that we use in social epidemiology when we really try to capture social class as an important upstream causal determinant.